อที่น่าสนใจมากๆนะครับ Exploring the Criminal Mind OCSEA Perpetrator Survey-Insights and Strategies for Prevention นะครับซึ่งผู้ที่จะมาให้ความรู้กับเราคือ Professor Michael Salter Director of Childlight UNSW Australia นะครับซึ่งหัวข้อนี้เนื้อหาจะเป็นการพูดคุยนะครับเกี่ยวข้องกับเรื่องของเบื้องหลังของแนวคิดวิธีคิดและพฤติกรรมของอาชญากรนะครับในการก่อคดีที่เกี่ยวข้องกับการละเมิดและแสวงหาประโยชน์ทางเพศกับเด็กนะครับเนื้อหาการสำรวจนี้เนื้อหาของการวิจัยครั้งนี้จะเป็นอย่างไรนะครับ Not to take up any more time I would like to hand over to the Professor Michael Salter. Please give a hand. Professor, you are mute. Sorry.
There we go.
Yes, we can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you also for the invitation to speak to you this morning about the important work that we've carried out in Australia, the UK, and the US. And we've also been speaking with the UNICEF Regional Office about the potential for also conducting this research in Thailand. So I hope that our presentation today provides you with some useful information to protect children from child sexual abuse, but that it also shows you the potential of this research project. So today I'll be presenting you with the findings of the world's largest perpetration prevalence survey on child sexual abuse ever undertaken. A lot of what we know about child sexual abuse and how common it is comes from victimization surveys where we ask people whether or not they were sexually abused when they were children. In this survey, we asked men in these three countries whether or not they had ever sexually abused a child. And we also asked if they had sexual feelings or sexual interest in children. This is very important because a lot of the information that we have on perpetrators comes from the people who we catch. But as you'll see, we do not catch and prosecute the majority of people who sexually abuse children. So today I want to talk to you about how common sexual feelings and sexual behaviour towards children is across these three jurisdictions. We'll also talk about how common different types of child sex offending is. And then we'll look at understanding what are the pathways to offending, what are the paths by which people begin to move towards offending, and how do we disrupt those. And we'll also talk about evidence-based prevention strategies as well. So the main aim of the project was simply to understand how common is child sexual abuse, the perpetration of it in Australia, the UK, and the US, and also what are the risk factors for sexually abusing a child. We developed a survey. We brought together a range of different organisations from government, from law enforcement, from the finance sector, from civil society. We had people on our advisor group who were survivors of child sexual abuse, who were delivering mental health services, and they helped us create our survey. We received ethics approval from my university. And then we provided the survey through an online survey company that provides anonymity to survey participants. And so we could not tell if somebody reported in our survey that they'd sexually abused a child. It wasn't possible for us to know who that person was. And that's really important because we wanted people to be as honest as possible in their responses to the survey. We wanted them to feel safe to tell us whether they had or hadn't engaged in criminal activity. The samples that we obtained through this survey are representative. What that means is that these samples are in important respects very similar to the Australian community, the American community, or the British community, and we can generalize our findings. We can make findings that there's a certain proportion of men in these three countries who are sexually interested or sexually abusing children. We asked a number of questions about their background, about their use of the internet. We asked about their health and well-being, including alcohol, drugs, depression, anxiety. We also asked if they had any history of child maltreatment, including physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and so on. We asked about their attitudes to child sexual abuse, particularly if they thought that there were situations where it was acceptable to sexually abuse a child. We asked about their use of pornography and also their use of child sexual abuse material. We asked about sexual feelings towards children and also any online or offline sexual behaviour, sexual abuse of children. Throughout the survey, we had attention checks just to make sure that people were carefully reading the survey. And if people failed the attention checks, we excluded them from our data. We also had a number of honesty checks within the survey as well to make sure that people were being honest. Over the last 40 years, there's been a number of research studies conducted where particularly men are asked about any illegal sexual activity, including child sexual abuse or rape. What we find is that as long as men know that the survey is anonymous and they won't be caught, by and large, they are quite honest. And this was also our experience in this survey. So to understand whether men had any sexual feelings towards children, we asked 6 questions. We asked them, do you have any sexual feelings towards people below the age of 18? But we also asked, would you have sexual contact with a child of a particular age if you knew that nobody would find out? We asked them if they had any concerns about their sexual feelings towards children. And we also asked a question where we said, what's the lowest age that you typically find attractive? And men could answer anything, including an age below the age of 18. So that's how we determined if men had sexual feelings towards children. We asked 5 questions about sexual offending towards children. So knowingly viewing pornographic material containing children, flirting or having sexual conversations with a child below the age of 18, having webcammed in a sexual way with a child, paying for any sexual interactions, images or videos online involving a child, and having sex or sexual contact with a person below the age of 18 while over the age of 18. I want to emphasize that the results I'll present to you today do not capture any behavior committed by the men when they were themselves children. So this all pertains to their behavior when they were over the age of 18, but not when they were 14, 15, 16. So I just want to look at these 3 categories for a moment. This is the proportion of people who have sexual feelings only. So they said that they had some sexual feelings towards children, but they had not offended. That was about 10% of men in Australia and the US, slightly lower, although not by much in the UK. So this is a group of people who, as I said, they indicated some sexual interest in children, but they reported that they had not acted on it yet. There was then a similar proportion, around 5% of men who reported that they had engaged in some sexual offence against a child. However, they also reported that they had no sexual feelings towards children. So I think this is quite interesting and important. There was then a group who reported that they had sexual feelings towards children and they had also sexually abused a child. So this was around 5 to 6% of men in Australia and the UK, but as you can see, it was much higher in the United States. Now, why would we divide up the data like this? So it's really important for us to know that some men who sexually abuse children may not have a particular sexual interest in children. They might be doing it for some other reason. Whereas we then have other offenders who are sexually motivated to offend. We're going to talk about that difference, that much higher rate of men with sexual feelings who offend in the United States. We're going to look at why that might be in a moment. But using our statistical data, using our analysis, we could start to tell, well, what's the difference between these three groups? What's the difference between the men with sexual feelings only, the men who have sexually offended, and then the men with sexual feelings who had also offended against children? So men with sexual feelings only who had not offended, compared to other men, they were younger on average, they were more likely to live in the city. They had lower incomes, although younger men tend to have lower incomes compared to older men. They were more likely to report that they'd been sexually abused. There was some evidence that they had a substance abuse problem. In terms of their attitudes, they denied that child sexual abuse was harmful. They thought that sexual abuse didn't hurt children. They also reported higher levels of psychological distress. Now, these men were not only younger than most men in our survey, but they were actually on average younger than men with sexual feelings who do offend. And so one of the things that this suggests to us is that this group of men with sexual feelings only are at risk of offending. As they age, they are more likely to go on to offend. So this is a group of men from a prevention point of view that's very important for us to understand, because we want to intervene with them early and support them not to hurt children. There was then men who sexually offend, but they had no sexual feelings towards children. Now, in our analysis, statistically, these men were actually quite similar to other men in the community. Although they had some characteristics, they had some risk factors, it was not very strong. And this also suggests that their offending might be easier to prevent. Their offending might be more situational or opportunistic. Compared to other men, they were more likely to be older, they were more likely to have a child in their household. They reported elevated rates of childhood adversity, but non-sexual. So they didn't report child sexual abuse, but they might be reporting physical abuse, being exposed to domestic violence, neglect, and so on. They consumed higher rates of deviant pornography, including violent pornography and also animal pornography, so bestiality. They also had elevated anxiety and depression scores, and they denied that child sexual abuse was harmful. So they have some risk factors here. Again, I think the prevention message for these men is, how do we create safer environments for children so that there are no situational, opportunistic chances to hurt children? Because these men were not sexually motivated in our data. Now, a big concern for us in our data was this group of men, about 5% of men in Australia, but 9% of men in the United States. They had sexual feelings towards children, and they were also sexually offending against children. These men statistically had a very strong cluster of risk factors. So this is a group of men who are quite similar to one another. Compared to other men in the community, they were more likely to be married or living with a partner. They were more likely to have a professional job where they work with children. They were much more likely to report that they'd been sexually abused as children. They were about 6 times more likely to report that. But they had other experiences of child abuse as well. They were more depressed and anxious. Like the other categories of men, they denied that child sexual abuse was harmful. They were consuming much higher rates of deviant pornography. So they were 12 times more likely to consume violent pornography, but they were 26 times more likely to consume animal pornography, bestiality pornography. They were much more likely to use privacy software. So they were using software on their computer that hid their online activity. They were using encryption, VPNs, or the Tor network. They were also more likely to subscribe to romance websites and dating apps. So that's interesting. Although these men are more likely to be married, and most men, once they have a partner, they use dating apps less because they already have a girlfriend or a wife. These men, they were partnered, but they were also more likely to use romance websites and dating apps. And one of the likely reasons for that is they may be looking for women online who have children, and they may be looking to access her children. They were also misusing prescription drugs as well, higher rates on average. So I think there's lots of reasons to be concerned about these findings because it paints a picture of a sexually motivated offender who is premeditated and trying to access children. So he is married. He is working with children. He may well appear to be quite respectable. He may well have good social and community relationships. But then behind the scenes, he doesn't believe that child abuse is wrong. And he's using privacy software to cover his tracks and to hide his online activities. He's also on romance and dating apps, potentially looking for single mothers to access their children as well. So when we look at these two groups of men, so we've got men with sexual feelings, some who have not offended and others who have offended. The men who have offended against children, again, more likely to be married, more likely to be working with children, more sexually active online, watching violent and bestiality pornography, using privacy software and using romance websites and dating apps. So what distinguishes between a man with sexual feelings who doesn't abuse children and a man with sexual feelings who does abuse children? In our data, it was primarily their lifestyle and their behavioral choices, in which men who abuse children were making a range of decisions to facilitate their access to children and also prevent themselves from being detected and arrested. That's what seemed to distinguish between men with sexual feelings who don't abuse children and men who do, was that men who do abuse children have made a number of choices that give them better access to children and prevent them from being detected. So let's look at the prevalence of different types of child sex offending amongst men in the three countries. So what you can see is elevated rates of child sex offending in all measures in the United States. The United States is that blue measure there. So 13.9% of men, of American men in our data, had sexually offended against a child, whereas in the other two jurisdictions, it was about 10%. So we asked men over the age of 18, have you ever had sexual contact with somebody under the age of 18? 3.2% of men in Australia said yes. A bit higher in the UK, 4.8%. It was 6% of men in the United States. We asked about online grooming. Have you ever flirted or had a sexual conversation with someone who you knew was a child? About 4% of men in Australia and the UK, 6% of men in the United States. We asked about viewing child sexual abuse material. Under 3% in Australia and the UK, 5% in the United States. We asked if people had ever engaged a child in a sexually explicit webcam or live stream. Under 2% in Australia and the UK, over 4% in the United States. We also asked about paying for sexual content of a child, so paying for videos, images, or an online sexual interaction. Again, 2% in Australia and the UK, and almost 5% in the United States. So in and of themselves, these findings are quite shocking. In my country, it means that about 1 in 10 men has abused a child. In the United States, as you can see, it's higher than that. In my country, what it means is that about 1 in 50 men has sexually webcammed with a child. About 1 in 50 men has paid for an online sexual interaction with a child. But in the United States, much higher, about 1 in 20. So we're starting to get an understanding of how common is child sexual abuse in these 3 jurisdictions. But what we're also seeing is that rates of child sexual abuse are not the same in every country. Each country has a different history. Each country has a different culture. Each country has a different politics, a different economics. Countries have different laws. And these high-level factors are changing, increasing or decreasing the rate of both online and offline sexual abuse. So through our analysis, we were able to examine why. Why are we seeing higher rates of child sexual abuse in the United States compared to Australia or the UK? The magnitude of this difference was actually greatest for commercial child sexual exploitation. The magnitude was greatest for men who had paid for online sexual interactions, engaged in a sexually explicit webcam, or deliberately watched pornographic material containing children. I think one of the explanations here is that the United States internet regulation, internet law, and censorship is far less strict than it is in Australia or in Britain. It may be that the way in which countries write legislation and law around the internet can either facilitate or prevent online child sexual abuse, including sexual exploitation. What we also found was that in the United States, adverse childhood experiences, rates of child abuse and neglect are much higher than the other 2 countries. And what we see in our data is a relationship between childhood abuse and the risk of sexual interest and sexual offending against children. I want to emphasize that this relationship is not direct. It doesn't mean that just because a boy is abused as a child, that he will go on to abuse children. But what we do know is that the more abuse and neglect there is in the community and the higher the rates of child maltreatment, then the worse outcomes there are for the community in terms of their behavioural health, their mental health, their physical health, and so on. Child abuse and neglect has a very negative impact on long-term outcomes. In our data, what we seem to see is that there is a proportion of boys who are vulnerable. If they experience abuse and neglect in childhood, they are vulnerable to becoming sexually interested in children or sexually abusing children. And this is, again, important from a prevention point of view. So let's understand and prevent pathways to offending. So as I mentioned, adverse childhood experiences becomes really critical. There is a vicious circle with child abuse. Now, many people who are abused as children will grow up and they will be very good parents. It's not determined. People have choice, they have free will. However, as I said, adverse childhood experiences is a really important component. If we want to protect children in the future, we need to protect children now. But we also need to consider unsafe technology services and platforms. What we saw in our data was that men who abused children were intentionally using encryption. They were intentionally using VPNs. They were intentionally using the Tor network or the so-called darknet in order to abuse children. They were accessing romance sites and dating sites in order to get access to single mothers. So if we want to disrupt pathways to offending, we also need to think about the internet and the online ecology, the online environment, because depending on the laws that we pass in each country, some laws will prevent child sexual abuse, but the lack of adequate regulation can permit child sexual abuse. There's also a question here about opportunity. Offenders are not only motivated to offend, but they need the opportunity to offend. Some offenders have an aptitude for technology, which is why they can use technology to offend. But access to children is also important. So how do we disrupt offenders' access to children? And that's a big question, particularly since in our data, some offenders were more likely to be married, living with a partner, and much more likely to work with children. It's also important for us to understand that many offenders appear to be of good character. As I said, they're married, they're working with children, they have a good job, they appear to be respectable. If our child protection system is primarily focused on low-income offenders or offenders who are abusing outside the family but not inside the family, if our efforts to protect children are not able to detect offenders who are wealthy, well-respected, and so on, then we will miss many offenders, according to our data. What we also found really consistently in our data is that men with a sexual interest in children and men who sexually abuse children, they view pornography, they view adult pornography much more frequently. So it's not simply that they're viewing pornography, they're looking at a lot of pornography, but also the type of pornography that they are looking at is deviant. So they're looking at violent pornography, but they're also much more likely to consume animal and bestiality pornography. So very unusual and quite sick pornography. They also have the attitude in general that sexual abuse does not harm children. So this was very consistent across men with sexual feelings, men who sexually offend, and men with sexual feelings who do abuse children. Those three groups of men, they all believed that sexual abuse, there's nothing wrong with it. So they have a particular problem in terms of their attitudes and their belief system. So we can start to develop what I've called a biopsychosocial model of child sex offending. There's biological aspects, physiological aspects to the offending. There's psychological aspects to the offending. And there's also social aspects to the offending as well. When we talk about no single one of these factors leads somebody to sexually abuse a child. But once we start to cluster these risk factors in, we can start to understand the different pathways to offending. So firstly, biological, that for some boys and men, there's an underlying vulnerability to a sexual disorder. Sexual interest in children, sexual interest in animals, sexual interest in violence, and also hypersexuality. A lot of the men in our data were sexually preoccupied. They had a heightened level of sexual interest, and their sexual interests were quite broad. So there may well be, for some boys and men, some underlying biological vulnerability, particularly once they've experienced trauma or child abuse. As you saw in our data, some of these men were also using prescription drugs, had other problems with substance abuse. And we know that drugs and substances can disinhibit and make people more likely to engage in behavior that they might not otherwise if they were sober. From a psychological point of view, many of these men had beliefs and attitudes that supported the abuse of children. They also had elevated levels of anxiety and depression. From a social point of view, we can talk about a kind of a male sexual entitlement, that this was a group of men who believed that they had the right to sexually abuse children and that there's nothing wrong with that. And we can also start to think about our own culture and the ways in which sometimes our cultures, our different cultures, can reinforce this male sexual entitlement. The prevalence of child maltreatment at a community level was very important in our data. So too is an unregulated technology sector. I think there's no doubt from our data, especially if we compare those three countries, so if we compare the United States to Australia and the UK, that one of the reasons why there's higher rates of child sexual abuse in the United States is because the US has quite lax and loose laws, legislation around the internet. And so there's a question here about how we regulate the technology sector so that online services and products are safe. We can also think about online abuse subcultures. Many of the men who are in our data who are offending, they were using encryption, they were going onto encrypted social media apps, they were going onto the Tor network. Now, those are not only places to access child sexual abuse material, those are also places to meet other pedophiles, other abusers, to talk about abusing children, to plan abusing children. So we have big concerns about the existence of large online networks of offenders who are normalizing the abuse of children and teaching one another how to abuse. But from a social point of view, these were also men that often had access to children through their work, through their family networks, through their social networks as well. So I'm going to close the presentation by looking at what these findings mean in terms of prevention. Many of you will be familiar with the prevention triangle. And so primary prevention refers to preventing abuse before it happens, And often primary prevention strategies are quite broad and they target the entire community or they target large portions of the community. Secondary prevention refers to working with groups who are at risk. They are at heightened risk of sexually abusing children. And then tertiary prevention refers to interventions after the harm has taken place. How do we prevent recurrence? Now that somebody has abused a child, how do we stop them from abusing a child again? So we'll just look at these three aspects of prevention. So from a primary prevention point of view, I think the message of this presentation is very clear. It's important that we prevent child maltreatment and neglect. If we don't do that, then what we find is that we have a larger group of men in the community as they grow up who are a risk to children. In our data, men who had no childhood abuse or adversity at all, about 5% of those men are engaged in the sexual abuse of children. But for men who had experienced very abusive childhoods, so for men who reported in our survey that they had experienced 10 different types of childhood abuse, so that's physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, exposure to domestic violence, so on and so forth. They reported 10 different types of child abuse to us. Those men, over 40% of those men had sexually abused a child. So our data was really clear. The more abuse there is in the community, then the larger the number of men who grow up and then subsequently become a risk to children. Excuse me. So very important for us to prevent child maltreatment and neglect. Also very important for us to challenge normalizing attitudes to child sexual abuse. So the men in our study who had sexual feelings towards children or who sexually abused children, those men all believed that sexually abusing children is not harmful. So from a primary prevention point of view, campaigns that reinforce the harmfulness of child sexual abuse and campaigns that reinforce that child sexual abuse is the fault of the adult perpetrator. It's not the fault of the child. We think that these are the sort of community messages that are important to prevent child sexual abuse. End-to-end encryption refers to online services and platforms that are highly secretive, platforms where it's often impossible for police to detect child sexual abuse. And end-to-end encryption is very popular in the technology sector. Facebook, for example, has rolled out end-to-end encryption through its Messenger app. WhatsApp is encrypted, Skype is encrypted, Zoom is encrypted, Tor, the dark net, is encrypted. And what we found was that child sex offenders overwhelmingly prefer encrypted online platforms. Why? Because their illegal activities can't be detected by law enforcement. So I am a strong critic of end-to-end encryption, particularly where there are no adequate child protection safeguards in place. And so I think the regulation of encryption is a very important question for us. There's also questions about the regulation of adult pornographic content. It was very easy for the offenders in our study to access very violent adult pornography or pornography involving animals, bearing in mind that animal pornography in my jurisdiction is illegal. It's unlawful, and yet there was still quite high levels of access in our survey. And given the connection between violent and animal and deviant pornographic content and sexually abusing children, I think there's questions here about the role of government in regulating adult pornographic content to make sure that that material conforms to the legislation of that country. And so why is there so much violent pornography? Why is there so much deviant pornography? What can countries do to prevent this? I think our study also points to the importance of safety by design and the mandating of safe online products and services. How do we make sure that the online products and services that are available, whether that's a romance site or a dating app, whether it's a social media messaging platform, making sure that these are safe and making sure that they can't be misused to sexually abuse children. Secondary prevention or early intervention, as I mentioned, that's where the prevention focus looks at areas of heightened risk. Now, we know from our data that men who abuse children are actually more likely to work with children. So it's critically important that in our child-focused institutions, such as schools, for example, we are making sure that we have firm principles of child safety and child protection, and that we are very carefully screening all employees to make sure that they are there for the right reasons. It's also important recognizing that for boys who have been traumatized or abused, that they are at heightened risk of going on to abuse. We need to provide therapeutic support to traumatized boys and men. We should provide them with that support anyway because they deserve that support, but also providing therapeutic support, particularly to sexually abused boys and men, helps restore a healthy developmental pathway so that they can grow up to become adults who are not at risk to children. I think we could also do more work in communicating to boys and men who are consuming excessive amounts of pornography or who are consuming violent and deviant pornography. I think we could do more to reach out to those boys and men and ask, are you worried about your online behavior? And can we provide you with services or resources to reduce your risk to other people? Particularly animal pornography in our study was a big red flag for somebody who was also sexually abusing a child. And we've seen that in other reviews of criminal cases of men who sexually abuse animals, the majority of those men are also child sex offenders. So I think this is an important red flag for us in terms of their pornography use. In terms of secondary prevention, it's also important that we're thinking about services for people who are concerned with their sexual feelings and their sexual behaviour towards children. In the Australian data, we had about 15% of men who said that they had sexual feelings towards children. And 1 in 3 of those men said that they wanted help for their sexual feelings. Now, Australia does not have a fully functional program for this group of men. Some of you might have heard of Stop It Now, which is a prevention service that runs in the United Kingdom and in Europe. There's also prevention services in the United States that specifically target men and anyone actually who is worried that they might offend against a child and wants help to stop. So certainly my country is going through the process of establishing a service like this, but we haven't established it yet. But I think there's no question from our data that such a service is really important. And then tertiary intervention, what do we do after offenders have abused? Our data really points to the fact that many offenders are educated, they have financial resources, they have a good reputation. They're premeditated, they are using encryption, they're networking online, they're in professional roles with children, and many of them are married and living with children. This group of men is actually a particular threat to children. Now, again, in Australia, I don't think that we do a good job. I don't think that we do a good job of detecting these men. I think it is very difficult when you have a middle-class, wealthy man who is sexually abusing a child to proactively detect him. But I think it is a very important conversation. How do we address this picture? It's really important that we are not only targeting child sex offenders who are dysfunctional, who are low income, or they are only abusing outside the family or online. One of the points I will make before I close is that many of the behaviours that we recorded in our data set, including online behaviours, leave a financial footprint. These men are purchasing a lot of online sexual services. They're subscribing to different apps. They're doing things that would be visible to a bank. So cooperation with the financial sector is really crucial. We know that a number of banks are looking to detect travelling sex offenders who, for example, travel from Australia into Southeast Asia to abuse good. We know that many banks are also trying to detect live streaming payments. That's important. But our data points to a broader pattern of economic behaviour associated with the abuse of children that may actually help us to target or to detect some of these offenders who otherwise appear to be of good character. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for sitting through the presentation. I know that it's a lot of data. We're really excited about the potential to partner with friends and colleagues in Thailand or in other countries through Southeast Asia to develop a survey that is appropriate to your context, that asks questions, that helps you to strengthen your child protection responses on the ground. So those are conversations that we're starting to have this month and over the coming months, and that's really exciting. We can play some role in collaborating with you in this important work. But otherwise, thank you again for your attention and best of luck with all of your efforts to protect children in your country. Thank you.
ขอเสียงตบมือให้กับ Professor Michael Salter นะครับ Thank you, Professor, for sharing valuable insights with us. and I'm sure that you've been inspired and we learned a lot from you so ตอนนี้นะครับสำหรับท่านที่ติดตามมาผมเชื่อว่าทุกท่านประทับใจกับการบรรยายของอาจารย์ Professor Michael Salter นะครับเรามี QR Code ที่สามารถดาวน์โหลด Presentation สไลด์เมื่อสักครู่นี้แต่เป็นภาษาไทยนะครับสามารถจะนำไปลงรายละเอียดเพิ่มเติมและนำไปต่อยอดนะครับเพื่อที่เราจะได้เรียนรู้เรื่องพฤติกรรมของผู้กระทำผิดแล้วนำมาต่อยอดในการดำเนินงานเชิงป้องกันเพื่อปกป้องเด็กๆในประเทศไทยของเราด้วยนะครับเห็นหลายท่านยังมีแววตาที่สดใสอยู่นะครับเชื่อว่าวันนี้เราเปลี่ยนไปด้วยความรู้และมากกว่านั้นแรงบันดาลใจที่เราได้รับจากการที่เราได้มานั่งรวมกันในห้องนี้นะครับแล้วก็เราได้มองเห็นหลายท่านหลายหน่วยงานที่ได้ทำงานเพื่อการปกป้องเพื่อทำให้ประเทศไทยของเรามีพื้นที่อินเทอร์เน็ตที่ปลอดภัยยิ่งขึ้นด้วยกันนะครับผมอยากจะขอใช้เวลาประมาณ1 นาทีสุดท้ายนะครับก่อนที่เราจะปิดเซสชันวันนี้แนะนำเกี่ยวกับเรื่องของอาหารกลางวันนะครับทางผู้จัดนะครับมีการจัดเตรียมอาหารกลางวันให้กับทุกท่านนะครับนำชิปสีเหลืองไปแลกอาหารกลางวันแล้วก็รับประทานที่ห้อง802นะครับห้องนี้คือ801นะครับรับประทานที่ห้อง802นะครับไม่นำอาหารเข้ามาในห้องนี้นะครับขออภัยนะฮะชิปสีฟ้านะครับเดี๋ยวจะไปแลกอาหารว่างซะก่อนนะขออภัยครับชิปสีฟ้านะครับแลกอาหารกลางวันนะครับแล้วก็ไม่นำเข้ามารับประทานในห้องนี้นะครับและไม่นำไปรับประทานที่ระเบียงด้านนอกนะครับรับประทานที่ห้อง802เท่านั้นนะครับแล้วก็ขอความร่วมมือไม่สูบบุหรี่บริเวณอาคารและสถานศึกษานะครับช่วงบ่ายยังมีอีกหลายเซสชันนะครับสามารถติดตามได้ตามตารางที่ตั้งอยู่ด้านหน้าห้องนะครับก็ขอบคุณทุกท่านนะครับที่เข้ามาอยู่ร่วมกันในห้อง801วันนี้นะครับก็เสร็จสิ้นพิธีเปิดในการประชุมวิชาการระดับชาติเนื่องในวันส่งเสริมอินเทอร์เน็ตปลอดภัย Safer Internet Day 2025ตบมือให้ตัวเองอีกครั้งหนึ่งดีไหมครับและผมหมดหน้าที่แล้วนะครับผมพีรพลอนุตตรโสดนะครับสวัสดีครับ